Imagine discovering the love of your life is secretly seeing her CEO, turning your world upside down. But that betrayal? It was only the beginning of a journey I never saw coming. It started with a late-night email. I was sitting in bed, half asleep, when my wife, Julia, got up to grab her phone. It was around midnight, and as soon as she read whatever notification had just come through, she turned away, her face hidden from me. It seemed like a small thing, something I could brush off. But as I lay there, watching her type furiously, I felt the first prickle of doubt. Julia and I had been married for 5 years, and I'd always admired her ambition. She'd recently been promoted to a senior role at her company, working directly under the CEO. She talked about him constantly, about his vision, his drive. I'd met him at a few company events, and he was charismatic, I'll give him that. But that night, watching her type with that intensity, I started to wonder just how close she and her boss really were. "Everything all right?" I asked, keeping my tone casual, trying not to sound suspicious. She looked up, almost startled, like she'd forgotten I was there. "Yeah, sorry, just a work thing. You know how it is with Mark," she said with a small smile before setting her phone down and climbing back into bed. I wanted to believe her. But something about the way she was suddenly glued to her phone in the evenings, her late nights at the office, the way she lit up whenever she talked about him, it was starting to wear on me. A few days later, Julia mentioned she'd be going on a weekend business trip. "Mark's got a big conference lined up, and he wants me there for support," she said, gathering her things with barely a glance in my direction. Her tone was casual, as if this was just another day at the office, but my gut told me otherwise. "Weekend conference? Isn't that a bit last minute?" I asked, trying to sound offhand, though the skepticism in my voice was clear. She shrugged, brushing it off. "It's just how he works. Last minute, high stakes, always on the go." She smiled, as though it was an endearing quirk of his. I tried to push down the uneasy feeling creeping over me, reminding myself that this was her career, her moment to shine. She was thrilled about her recent promotion, and I wanted to be supportive. But as I watched her pack, I couldn't help noticing the extra care she was putting into it. She chose her best clothes, even a perfume she usually reserved for special occasions. That Friday night, she left for the trip, and I watched her go, her smile a little too bright, her goodbye kiss feeling hollow. The house felt emptier than ever. I told myself to stop overthinking, to trust her. But something in me couldn't let go of the idea that this wasn't just a work trip. The weekend passed slowly, and I tried to keep myself busy, telling myself that this conference was no big deal. Julia texted occasionally, short updates saying she was busy, that everything was going great. But each message only added to the unease simmering inside me. On Sunday evening, I went to grab a cup of coffee from the kitchen and noticed Julia's laptop sitting on the counter. She rarely left it at home when she traveled for work, so I assumed she must have forgotten it in her rush to pack. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but curiosity, and a growing suspicion, got the best of me. I opened the laptop, only intending to check her calendar to see what she had been up to. But as I was closing out the screen, an email notification popped up in the corner from a hotel. It was a payment receipt for a 5-star hotel suite. My stomach twisted as I clicked on it. The reservation was for 2 guests. My heart raced as I stared at the screen, my mind spinning with questions. Why would she need a suite for 2? She hadn't mentioned sharing the room with anyone, and the thought of her and Mark alone in a luxury suite felt like a punch to the gut. Trying to keep my composure, I printed out the email and closed the laptop. The doubts that had been building for weeks were suddenly too real, too concrete. But I couldn't confront her yet. Not without more. Julia returned Sunday night, her face glowing with excitement as she recounted her productive weekend. She mentioned meetings, long sessions about strategic goals, and Mark's incredible insights. I nodded, forcing a smile, but all I could think about was the hotel receipt with that damning 2 guests note. The entire time she talked, my mind raced, weighing whether to confront her then and there. But something inside me told me to wait, to let her speak, to see if she would slip up. And then, it happened. "You must be exhausted," I said, keeping my tone light. "Staying up in a cramped hotel room for a whole weekend like that." For a split second, a flicker of something crossed her face. She hesitated, just briefly, then covered it up with a quick laugh. "Actually, it wasn't that bad. Mark booked us a nice place, he wanted us to have space to work properly." "Us?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Didn't you have your own room?" She looked away, grabbing her suitcase. "Oh, yeah, but, we were in and out of meetings all day, so we'd sometimes work in his suite." She laughed again, trying to brush it off, but the forced tone in her voice only added fuel to my suspicions. That was the confirmation I'd needed. I forced myself to act normal, smiling as I listened to her go on about the conference. But inside, something broke. The small doubts that had started as whispers had become a thunderous roar in my mind. I knew now that I couldn't let it go. That night, as she slept beside me, I lay awake, plotting my next move. I would catch them in the act, and I would make sure there was no escaping the truth. The next morning, I woke up with a clear plan. I knew that to confront Julia, I'd need undeniable proof, something she couldn't twist or explain away. My mind was set, I'd track her movements, keep an eye on her, and gather every piece of evidence I needed to end this deception. Over breakfast, Julia was cheerful, talking about work projects and upcoming late nights at the office. I listened, keeping my expression neutral, but every word only cemented my determination. She had no idea I was onto her. When she left for work, I contacted a private investigator. I knew that tracking her myself could lead to mistakes, and I wanted a professional to handle it, someone who could provide the concrete evidence I needed to end things cleanly. After describing the situation, the investigator assured me he'd start immediately, keeping a close watch on her during and after work hours. That evening, I went through her things with a careful eye. I found nothing suspicious at first, but in her purse, tucked into a side pocket, was a business card from a luxury hotel downtown, the same hotel that had sent the email. It was just a small thing, but holding it in my hand, I felt a surge of rage. The pieces were coming together, and soon, I'd have the full picture. From that day on, I waited, playing the part of the unsuspecting husband while the investigator worked behind the scenes. My focus shifted from our marriage to one thing alone, gathering everything I'd need to reveal the truth. A few days later, I got a call from the investigator. "I have something," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Your wife was with him last night, dinner at an upscale restaurant, and they didn't leave until almost midnight. They went straight to the hotel afterward." My heart pounded as he spoke, my suspicions finally confirmed. I told him to keep gathering evidence, to document everything. I wanted to see it all, the receipts, the photos, any messages he could recover. This wasn't going to be a simple confrontation. I wanted irrefutable proof of her betrayal, every last detail. A day later, the investigator sent over a file containing photos. I opened them with a sense of dread and grim satisfaction. There was Julia, sitting across from Mark at a candlelit dinner, laughing at something he'd said, her hand resting on his arm as if they were in their own world. The next set of photos was taken outside the hotel entrance, showing them entering together, his hand on the small of her back. And then, the final photo, Julia and Mark, just visible through the hotel room's window, standing close, their faces mere inches apart. I felt a wave of fury, mixed with a sickening clarity. This was it. I had the proof I needed, evidence she couldn't explain away with half-hearted excuses about work and meetings. That night, I lay beside her in bed, listening to her steady breathing, wondering how long she'd been lying to me. But now, the power was in my hands. And as I drifted to sleep, one thing was certain, this was only the beginning of her reckoning. The following morning, I got up with a newfound sense of purpose. Julia was already in the kitchen, making coffee, her face a picture of calm, as if nothing in her world was amiss. I watched her for a moment, remembering the woman I thought I'd married, and felt a pang of something, sadness? Betrayal? But then I remembered the images, her hand on his arm, the intimacy that was meant to be between us. Any sympathy I'd felt evaporated. "Hey," she said brightly, handing me a mug. "Guess what? Mark wants me to stay late tonight for a project we're working on. Probably won't be back until late." I felt a surge of anger but forced myself to remain calm. "That's fine," I replied, smiling. "Work comes first, right?" I could see she was surprised by my easy acceptance, but she smiled back, looking relieved. Once she left, I set my plan into motion. I called my lawyer, letting him know what I'd discovered, forwarding him the evidence from the investigator. He agreed that we had a strong case and that with this evidence, we could ensure a swift divorce, with Julia leaving empty-handed. The next part was setting the stage for the confrontation. I decided it was time for her to face the truth in the most undeniable way. I called a few close friends, people who had known us for years, and invited them over for a casual evening, leaving Julia out of the loop. The truth would come out, but not in private. She would face it in front of people who knew her, people she wouldn't be able to lie to or manipulate. That night, as I waited for her to come home, I went over every detail in my mind, knowing the confrontation would be brutal but necessary. That evening, my closest friends arrived, each one looking a bit confused but trusting that I had a reason for the impromptu gathering. We shared a few quiet drinks, the mood strained as they sensed something serious was coming. I hadn't told them why they were there, only that they needed to be there. Around 10 p.m., I heard the familiar sound of Julia's car pulling into the driveway. I glanced at my friends, giving them a slight nod. They looked back at me, some in silent support, others with a flicker of concern. I'd prepared them for a revelation but not for the intensity of what was coming. Julia walked through the door, startled to find our friends gathered in the living room. Her face paled slightly as she took in the scene, her eyes darting from one person to the next, finally settling on me. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. I stood up, holding a stack of printed photos, each one damning, each one capturing a moment she thought was hidden. I held her gaze, my voice calm but sharp. "We're here because it's time to tell the truth, Julia." She looked around, confused, then her expression shifted to something harder. "What are you talking about?" I took a step closer, holding up one of the photos. "Explain this," I said, my voice steady, though I could feel the anger boiling beneath the surface. It was the photo of her and Mark at the hotel entrance, his hand on her back, their faces close. Her face drained of color, and she stared at the photo, her mouth opening and closing as she fumbled for an explanation. That's not what it looks like. It was just a work dinner." I held up another photo, this time of the two of them through the hotel window, leaning in close, her hand resting on his chest. "You expect me to believe that this was just work?" I asked, my voice low but resolute. Julia's shoulders slumped as the weight of the evidence crushed any attempt at denial. She looked around at our friends, who sat in stunned silence, watching the reality of her betrayal unfold. She finally met my gaze, her face a mix of shame and defiance. I didn't mean for it to happen this way," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Well, it did," I replied, holding nothing back. "And now, everyone here knows the truth." Julia looked around, her eyes filling with a mixture of anger and humiliation as she realized the extent of her exposure. I handed the photos to my lawyer, who'd arrived quietly at the back, ready to finalize the next steps. I could feel the room's energy shift, everyone now knew who she really was, and there was no hiding anymore. As she turned to leave, I called after her. "This is the last time you walk through that door as my wife." And with that, I closed the chapter on us, knowing that there was no coming back from this betrayal. As the door closed behind Julia, the silence in the room was thick, a heavy weight settling on everyone as the reality of what had just happened took hold. My friends sat there, some still processing, others visibly angry on my behalf, and a few with expressions of stunned disbelief. I took a deep breath, feeling both relieved and raw, like a wound finally exposed to air. One of my friends, Kevin, was the first to break the silence. "I can't believe she did this to you, man. After everything you two had, it's just unreal." His words were heavy with disappointment, echoing what I had felt for weeks. The others nodded, each expressing a mix of shock and sympathy. It was strange and sad to see my closest friends processing the betrayal almost as painfully as I had. Julia had been part of this group, someone they trusted, and now, she was just a stranger. We talked late into the night. They offered their support, some even offering places to stay if I needed it, anything to help me through this. But I knew I wanted to be home. My lawyer had assured me that I could move forward with the divorce proceedings quickly, and after tonight, there was no hesitation left in me. I thanked everyone for being there and said my goodbyes, feeling the weight of their solidarity with every handshake and hug. Once everyone left, the quiet of the house felt strange, almost eerie. The spaces where Julia's things had been were now stark reminders of what we'd lost, not just a marriage, but the trust and comfort we once shared. The plans, the dreams, all of it felt like an illusion, now shattered beyond repair. Over the next few days, the legal process began. My lawyer worked efficiently, making sure Julia wouldn't leave with a cent more than the law required. She had been informed, and true to her proud nature, she didn't reach out, didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, she signed the documents quickly, perhaps hoping to distance herself from the scandal. My friends and family stood by me, calling, stopping by, ensuring I wasn't left alone to face the aftermath. The support helped, but healing took time, and I knew that the betrayal would stay with me for a while, a lesson about trust and resilience. As for Julia's relationship with Mark, the CEO, it soon crumbled as well. Word of the affair had leaked within her company, and his reputation took a hit that no amount of charm could undo. Eventually, I heard he'd resigned, leaving town to avoid the fallout. And me? I was ready to move forward, wiser and stronger. I'd learned that sometimes, the hardest truths can free us, and I was finally ready to embrace a life built on authenticity. The days after the divorce were a strange mix of liberation and loneliness. The house felt emptier without Julia's presence, but instead of sadness, there was a strange sense of peace. For the first time in a long while, I felt in control of my life, my choices, and my future. The betrayal had cut deep, but now that the truth was out and the divorce was finalized, it felt like I was finally breathing clean air again. Friends continued to check in, especially Kevin, who'd been there the night of the confrontation. He was quick to remind me that there were still good people out there, people who truly valued friendship and loyalty. "Let's go out sometime," he kept saying. "Get you back out there, remember what it's like to have a good time without all the baggage." It took a few more weeks, but eventually, I took him up on the offer. He organized a small get-together with a few old friends I hadn't seen in years. I'd expected it to be awkward, but to my surprise, it was the most natural I'd felt in a long time. For the first time, I was able to laugh, really laugh, without the shadow of suspicion or betrayal hanging over me. As the months passed, I focused on building a life that felt like my own again. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects, staying busy. I even picked up some of the hobbies I'd put aside during my marriage. Biking, weekend hiking trips, late nights with friends, I reclaimed the parts of myself that I'd neglected, piece by piece. One day, while cleaning out a drawer, I found the stack of photos the investigator had given me. The evidence of Julia's betrayal was still there, raw and undeniable, but it no longer held the same power over me. I didn't need reminders of what I'd gone through, I was already past it. Without a second thought, I tossed the photos in the trash, letting go of the final piece of her. The months continued, and though the scars were still there, they'd healed into reminders of resilience, not bitterness. I'd learned the hard way to value my own worth, to protect my trust, and to move forward with a clearer vision of who I wanted to be. And as I stood there, looking out over a life that was once again truly mine, I knew I was finally free. Just as life was beginning to settle into a steady rhythm, an unexpected email landed in my inbox. It was from a former colleague of Julia's, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. The subject line was simple: "You need to see this." Curiosity got the best of me. I opened the email to find a long message and a forwarded link. The email detailed how Julia and Mark's affair had been the final blow in a string of scandals that had taken down his entire executive team. Mark had been forced to resign, not just because of their relationship, but because internal audits revealed financial improprieties tied to their business trips. Julia, it seemed, had been benefiting from Mark's unethical behavior, with expenses covered that were clearly personal. The forwarded link led to an article on a corporate watchdog site. It detailed how Mark's misconduct had left the company in turmoil, and Julia's name was mentioned, albeit briefly, as someone involved in his downfall. I stared at the screen, a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief swirling inside me. It was poetic justice, in a way. Her ambition, her willingness to cross lines, had come back to haunt her. The very relationship she'd thrown away her marriage for had destroyed her career and tarnished her reputation. I forwarded the article to Kevin, adding only one line: "Guess karma isn't so patient after all." He replied almost immediately, with a simple, "Told you she'd get what was coming to her." For the first time, I felt completely at peace. Julia's downfall wasn't something I had sought, but knowing she hadn't gotten away unscathed made moving on feel a little lighter. In the months that followed, I worked tirelessly to rebuild my life. The pain of betrayal didn't simply vanish, but each day, it faded a little more. What surprised me most was how much clarity I gained as time went on. Looking back, I realized that Julia's affair wasn't just a betrayal of our relationship, it was a mirror reflecting the cracks that had formed long before her infidelity. For years, I had put her needs above mine, letting her ambition overshadow my dreams. Her betrayal forced me to see what I'd been ignoring: I needed to live for myself again. At first, I threw myself into work, focusing on projects I'd neglected during the chaos of our marriage. But something still felt missing. Nights were quiet, too quiet. My friends were supportive, but I needed something more, something to fill the void that had been left behind. One evening, as I was organizing some documents, I stumbled upon the email from Julia's former colleague about Mark's downfall. I reread it, realizing how close I had come to letting her selfishness define me. Inspired, I decided to create a blog, sharing my story anonymously. I didn't expect much from it, but writing became a therapeutic outlet. I detailed my experience, the lessons I'd learned, and advice for others dealing with betrayal. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly it would gain traction. Messages poured in, some from people thanking me for sharing, others opening up about their own stories. One message caught my attention: a woman named Tessa, who shared a similar experience with her husband's infidelity. She wrote about how she had felt trapped, afraid to leave, and how my posts had given her the courage to walk away. Her words struck a chord with me, and over time, our messages turned into long conversations. What began as support and understanding slowly grew into something deeper. Tessa and I shared our scars, our fears, and our hopes. It wasn't rushed or dramatic, it was a quiet, steady connection that felt authentic in a way I hadn't experienced in years. We decided to meet in person, and when we did, it felt like the start of something real. But just as things were beginning to stabilize, life threw me another curveball. One evening, as I was walking home from a dinner with Tessa, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was short and cryptic. "I need to talk. Please, it's important." At first, I ignored it, assuming it was spam or a wrong number. But then, another message came through. "It's Julia. Please don't delete this." I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious. My heart skipped a beat. Julia? After everything, why would she be reaching out now? I stared at the screen, torn between deleting the message and responding. Against my better judgment, I replied. What do you want? Her response was immediate. I need to talk to you in person. It's about Mark, and the child. The child. The words hit me like a freight train. I hadn't thought much about the baby since the divorce. I had convinced myself it wasn't my concern, that it was just another part of her tangled web. But now, curiosity gnawed at me. What could possibly be so urgent that she'd contact me after all this time? Reluctantly, I agreed to meet her at a nearby cafe. When I walked in, she was sitting in a corner booth, looking nothing like the confident woman I used to know. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed, and her posture tense. Thank you for coming, she said softly. I almost didn't, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering her voice. Mark's gone. He left me, and the baby. I'm alone, and I don't know what to do. Her words stunned me. The man she destroyed our marriage for had abandoned her, leaving her to face the consequences on her own. But before I could respond, she dropped another bombshell. And the baby, it's not his. I stared at her, my mind racing. What are you saying? She looked away, tears welling in her eyes. I don't know whose it is. Julia's confession left me speechless. How could she not know the father of her own child? Her words opened a floodgate of questions, doubts, and anger. I don't know what you expect me to do, I said, my voice cold. You made your choices, Julia. You lied, you cheated, and now you're dealing with the fallout. She nodded, her tears spilling over. I know I deserve this, but I didn't call you for pity. I just thought you should know. I thought it might be yours. Her words sent a jolt through me. Mine. The possibility hadn't even crossed my mind since the paternity test during the trial. We already did a test, I said sharply. It's not mine. She shook her head. That test was done before the baby was born. Mark arranged it. I don't know if it was accurate. A wave of doubt crashed over me. Could it be possible? Was there a chance that the child was mine after all? I wanted to dismiss her claim, to walk away and leave her to her mess, but the nagging uncertainty rooted me to the spot. If you're serious about this, I said finally, we'll do another test. A proper one. And if you're lying again, Julia, I swear this will be the last time you ever hear from me. She nodded, her expression a mixture of hope and dread. The following week, we met at a clinic to perform a new paternity test. The process was sterile and impersonal, the weight of the situation hanging heavy between us. Julia looked nervous, but I felt nothing, just a numb determination to finally close this chapter, one way or another. When the results came in a few days later, I opened the envelope alone, bracing myself for the truth. The answer was clear, undeniable. I wasn't the father. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly followed by a deeper sadness. Not for Julia, but for the child caught in the middle of her mistakes. I sent her the results with a brief message, "We're done. Don't contact me again." I expected to feel closure, and in many ways, I did. But just when I thought the story was over, I received one last piece of news that shook me to my core. A mutual friend called me, their voice low and serious. "Did you hear about Julia?" they asked. "No." "What now?" "She left. Took the baby and disappeared. No one knows where she went." The news stunned me. Julia, always so self-assured and calculated, had vanished without a trace. For a moment, I felt a pang of concern, wondering what had driven her to such extremes. But then, I let it go. Her story was no longer mine to carry. I had my life back, free from her lies, and I wasn't going to let her chaos pull me down again. As I stood on my balcony that evening, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I realized the truth: the unexpected twists and turns of life had shaped me, but they didn't define me. I was free to write my own story now, and this time, it would be mine alone. The weeks after Julia's disappearance felt surreal, almost like a strange dream I had finally woken up from. I thought about her less and less, the shock of her leaving with the baby fading as I focused on building a future free from her shadows. People occasionally reached out, curious, asking if I'd heard anything about her or if I knew where she'd gone. My answer was always the same: I have no idea, and I don't need to know. But it was hard not to think about the child, the innocent life she'd taken with her into whatever unknown future lay ahead. Part of me hoped they'd find stability, that Julia would rebuild her life in some way. But mostly, I focused on my own future. I was finally free, and I wasn't going to waste a second of it. One night, while clearing out the last of the old files in my office, I came across the remnants of my blog. The stories I'd posted, the responses I'd received, these had been my lifeline through the worst of it. I reread a few entries, reminded of the raw emotions that had driven me to write in the first place. It felt strange now, looking back, as if I was reading someone else's story. With a renewed sense of purpose, I decided to relaunch the blog, this time focusing on resilience and the lessons I'd learned about rebuilding one's life. I called it Starting Over Strong, and within days of the first post, the response was overwhelming. Messages came pouring in from people sharing their own stories, people who'd faced betrayal, heartache, and the unexpected challenges life throws at us. Connecting with these people grounded me, reminding me that, no matter what we go through, there is always a way forward. But life still had one more surprise waiting. Months later, on an ordinary Sunday morning, I was sitting at a cafe, sipping coffee and brainstorming topics for the next post, when a woman approached me. She looked familiar, but it took me a moment to place her. It was Tessa, the woman I had connected with online shortly after my divorce, the one who'd shared her story of betrayal with me. "Tessa?" I asked, surprised. She smiled, a warmth in her eyes that I hadn't expected. "I saw on your blog that you were speaking at a local event today. I thought I'd come by and finally meet you in person." We spent the next few hours talking, not just about our shared experiences of betrayal, but about the lives we were rebuilding. She told me how she'd found her footing after her own painful divorce, how she'd discovered her own strength, and I felt something I hadn't in a long time, a genuine connection, one built on shared resilience rather than pain. Over the following weeks, Tessa and I grew closer. What started as shared support slowly transformed into something deeper, a steady relationship grounded in honesty and mutual respect. With her, I didn't feel the need to be anyone but myself, and I could tell she felt the same. A year later, I found myself in a place I never could have imagined. Tessa and I had moved in together, our relationship unfolding naturally, without the pressure of past scars looming over us. We spent weekends hiking, traveling, building a life based on the freedom and authenticity we both craved. One evening, while sitting together on our porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she looked over at me and said, "You know, we both went through something terrible, but I think it brought us exactly where we were meant to be." I thought about everything, the betrayal, the pain, the years I'd lost to someone who had never truly valued me. And she was right. Every moment of suffering had led me to this life, this love, this feeling of true peace. I leaned over, wrapping my arm around her. "You're right," I said. "I wouldn't change a thing." And for the first time in years, I meant it. Months passed, life settled, and one autumn morning, Tessa came to me with a nervous smile and a small box in her hand. She placed it in my palm, eyes bright and full of emotion. I opened it slowly, my heart racing, and inside was a small white pregnancy test, with a tiny positive sign on it. I looked up at her, stunned, as joy filled her eyes. "We're having a baby," she whispered, laughing through tears. The news hit me like a wave of warmth and hope. After all the twists, betrayals, and heartbreaks, I had been given a second chance, not just at love, but at family. Standing there with her, our future ahead, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The past no longer haunted me, it had led me here, to this incredible, unexpected new chapter. And in that moment, I knew that everything, every trial, every betrayal, had been worth it. We were starting a new story, one that was entirely our own. And this time, it was a story I knew I could trust.